when you look at the natural areas of Mount Washington, they're pretty much the way they were historically. The sages, those the heteromelies, which are the what's known as California holly, the walnut trees, all known as Nogales walnut trees. Those are all natural to the terrain. So if you go to an area like, say, the park, Elyria Park, you're looking pretty much at a fairly natural state of the hill. What is interesting is the wild oats that we all see actually was an import from Spain. There were vaqueros up on the hill when it was rancho land. There have been spurs, Spanish spurs, found at times in the hill. The hill, Verdugo was granted the Rancho San Rafael in about 1781, I believe. Julio Verdugo utilized the land to some extent, his son. But in 1859, he deeded the southern portion, which included a good chunk of Mount Washington, to Jesse D. Hunter. Now, there was another rancho up there as well. There was a smaller rancho that was carved out of San Rafael known as Cañada de los Nogales, which is basically Glassell Park today. Mount Washington, though, survived as a Hunter property, and the land was deeded to George W. Morgan and Albert Judson, who later founded Highland Park. Subdividers at the time, all the way back to the 1880s, had looked at, we will build a tourist hotel, they will come. Then we will give them this great accommodation, this great place, they're going to see what a wonderful place this is, we're going to sell them the land. There was no real access to the top of the hill. This was very typical. Marsh actually was one of the first developers in LA who saw the potential of the hilltop and pushed to develop. This was one of the very first hilltops of any major significant. I mean, there was Bunker Hill, Angelino Heights, but they're very small hills compared to Mount Washington. Mount Washington was wild. I mean, it was a rugged, wild area. Marsh was a particularly interesting gentleman. He was only 35 when he did this subdivision. A very young man for doing this type of very visionary work. So he builds a tourist hotel and a cable railway to get up there, and he actually succeeded in doing it. But Marsh did. He built a more modest hotel. He hired Milwaukee Building Company as a design build firm, which was just getting started at the time. They later went on to do some of the most famous buildings, such as Grauman's Chinese, Hollywood Egyptian Theaters, a number of these buildings. Milwaukee Building, Meyer and Haller, was one of the premium contractors of the craftsman homes, the large craftsman homes of the time. And Marsh had them build we called a showcase house up there. It's a large craftsman, beautiful bungalow at Mount Washington Drive and San Rafael that's still there today. And he did that as a means of drawing people to the area to see this wonderful house. The lower cable car station on Avenue 43, which was built a year after the cable line was open, was built by Milwaukee Building, but we found on the permit that Fred R. Dorn, who was a very prominent architect at the time, designed that building. It's possible that Dorn also designed the hotel building itself, but because that was outside of the city at the time, we just don't have that information. Marsh was ever the entrepreneur, and he put out a newspaper known as the Mount Washington Eagle. It was actually a supplement to the LA Times. And this was every Sunday the Mount Washington Eagle would come out and say what was going on the hill, who bought land there, and it's a great history of the whole development. So the Marsh development is very well documented throughout its existence. And then, of course, as he sold off all the land, the Mount Washington Eagle disappeared. And later the hotel was closed because it wasn't making that much money. They shut down the cable line. The hotel became initially a hospital for veterans from World War I. That didn't last too long. They tried to make it into a boys' school. That didn't last too long. The building was vacant. And by 1925, it was basically slated for demolition. This is when
Paramahansa Yogananda
found the property. His story is that he saw it in a dream and he went out and found it. And his vision was to make this the headquarters of the Self-Realization Fellowship, which he had founded, and they purchased the land in 1925, and we have today this wonderful, beautiful historic facility, and it's between the history of the hotel, the history of Marsh, and then the later history of Self-Realization Fellowship, there is this, it's just an incredible part of our Mount Washington history up there. Mount Washington happened to be a hills hop above Arroyo Seco, and he liked that too, but his real draw was the Arroyo. And he built his own house in the Arroyo, began work there as early as 1896. He had bought the property, he built a small cottage. When they were trying to find a site for the museum and get it built, there were a number of offers from various developers and all who offered land for the museum. The idea, of course, is you build the museum, I do my subdivision, the museum is a draw, and we have the housing around the museum that I can sell for top dollar. Interesting thing is the building itself was built with money that came from a will by Carrie Jones, who passed away in 1909. And she had bequeathed $50,000 to build the what is now the existing building. But there was a proviso that building had to be built by 1914. Lummis did appreciate Mount Washington, and he wanted the Southwest Museum up there. He was adamant about the Southwest Museum being there.